What if I told you that your reaction to Joker reveals your greatest fears and worries about today's culture? I'm Jonathan Hetterly. Welcome to Psych Cinema. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. I'm not really going to look at the psychology found within the film, but around our reaction to the film. I'm going to specifically look at why we're more prone to focus on negativity. Then I'm going to look at how, when we recall incidences, we believe that they're more likely to happen. And finally, I'm going to explore why our brain tries to find these cause and effect relationships that really aren't there. But before we get started, do me a favor, subscribe to our channel. Now, I did do a separate video of my review of Joker, and overall, I liked the film. I compared this film to the Billy Joel song, "We Didn't Start the Fire," in the sense that it brings up a lot of important topics and issues, but it really does nothing with them. It's not really interested in exploring the nuance of mental illness, of social services. It's not really interested in exploring social upheaval and affluence and poverty. And so because of that, I really think the film allows the audience to go into it with a confirmation bias. You're really allowed to draw your own conclusions based upon your own perceived biases and beliefs about any one of those particular issues. And that's why we're seeing a lot of uproar and a lot of contempt for this film that I'm not sure it merits. So I want to really look at the psychology behind why there is such a hysteria around Joker, specifically about the people that find it really abominable and they find it really irresponsible. Why are people finding this film so dangerous? Well, let's dive into the psychology of what might be at the root of this uproar. So let's first look at this probability that the brain has of focusing more on negativity. This is known as the negativity bias. And this really comes from our brain. Our brain is designed to be hyper alerted to threats. But because of that, we're more prone to over-focus on negative and pain and really overlook or dismiss anything that's more positive or benign. Now that actually is a part of the film's narrative. If you notice Joaquin Phoenix, Arthur really says at the beginning to his social worker, doesn't it feel like things are just getting more crazy? And he himself has this propensity to only look for what's bad and wrong with society. And I think in some ways people are doing that in our own times, as well as that they're looking at this film and picking it apart for everything that it's not or what it doesn't do, right? So that's our negativity bias, that we look at a film and we say it's holding up a mirror to our culture and society. And for a lot of people right now, they're really worried and afraid about what's going on in our culture. They're worried about issues, whether it be about our politics and who's in the White House, issues in terms of gun violence and mass shootings. People are really worried and concerned about mental health and mental illness, even if there is any type of correlation or relationship with violent acts. People are worried about the state of our economics and job, our young adults, and whether or not they're flailing or flourishing as they graduate from college and step into independent adulthood. We see the border crisis and immigrants. There's all these types of worries and fears and problems in America. And I think that we're starting to see how that can really just snowball into our inability to step back and see a larger picture of good and bad. Because it's not as though these issues aren't topics and problems that we haven't struggled with before. And yet, for some reason, right now, and specifically with the movie Joker, we're finding that to be the most problematic and worrisome and dangerous film ever. I think that says more about our culture and how we're dealing with our fears and worries than it does about the Todd Phillips film. So now I want to talk about this bias called availability bias or availability heuristic. And this is actually sort of a shortcut that the brain does where it fears and worries about something that's going to happen based upon how quickly or easily it can recall information about that. And that's really something that our culture struggles with the onset of 24-hour news cycle and the spread of social media. You know, in the past, news and newspapers were really the medium that we would get information. but news reports were on at 6 o'clock at night and then maybe at 10 or 11 o'clock each day. And then you'd get the newspaper the next morning. Nowadays, you're going to get 24 hours rapid response news cycles, and then you're going to get everybody on the internet giving their own critique and personal point of view on the matter. And that really just generates a lot more awareness and belief in things. And that's really where the availability heuristic or availability bias really is a problem, because the more we can think about something that's happened, the more our brain takes a shortcut and manipulates us into believing that it's going to happen to us. And I really feel like that's some of what's at the heart of the uproar and worry about Joker, is that there is all of this worry that a film that really portrays an isolated white man who resorts to violence, people are genuinely worried about, could this incite other acts of violence? They cite the Aurora film shooting where a person really just mercilessly gunned down filmgoers that were wanting to see The Dark Knight Rises. People are pointing to all of the mass shootings and gun violence at schools or just in public events like Las Vegas and concerts and things of that nature. And because that is constantly cycling, people are really feared that this is going to happen. And so you even see that the parents of the victims of the Aurora shooting incident, they preemptively put out a press release where they were objecting to this film. They weren't asking that it not be released, but in some ways you have to ask yourself, did they actually stoke some of this uproar and fear than if it was going to be there to begin with? And that's really about this availability heuristic. Do we live in times where, because we have so much exposure to stories of what's happening, does it lead us to believe that it's a more likely and probable outcome for us than it really is? And again, that goes with, you pair that with the negativity bias. Most of the news cycle that goes through social media and national publications, it focuses on the negative. If you look at traditional media of the 60s and 70s with the news broadcasts, the old mantra was, if it bleeds, it leads. So negativity is always going to sell. It's always going to be more sensationalistic. It's always going to draw people's attention because it stokes their fears. And so if you have the negativity bias where we're only focusing on the negative, and then you add the availability heuristic, which means the more I readily think of something happening, the more my brain makes me believe it's going to happen to me, you create this uproar, and now we're living in a culture of just around-the-clock fear, worry, paranoia, and panic. And so now let's really talk about, I think, one of the most problematic aspects of the cultural uproar around Joker, and that's the illusory correlation. And what that basically means is when we incorrectly create a cause and effect relationship with something that is not true. And in the case of this, we want to look at how pop culture and entertainment does not incite or cause violence in real life. And this has been something that pop culture, films, music, television has always been an easy scapegoat for the motivations behind troubled or deranged people enacting violence. And it makes sense because at the heart of a lot of pop culture and entertainment are violent storylines where there are both protagonists but villains. And so it's not very difficult to look to film, television, books, to where there's going to be bad people, villains, that do harm to others. But then you see violence that's happening in real life, and there's a lot of people that just want to make this very clear relationship, cause and effect, or correlation to the entertainment industry inciting or romanticizing or endorsing or causing people to inflict harm and violence towards others. And all the science and research tells us that's not true. And yet as a culture, we continue to perpetuate this, that it's just a cycle. In the 80s, it was Tipper Gore, and it was highlighting rap music or music with its explicit language and content, and then this fear that this was going to corrupt and warp the brains of young people. When Spike Lee's incendiary and provocative film Do the Right Thing came out, people were so worried that it was going to provoke race riots around the country. And then even after Columbine and others, there's just been all of this uproar about violent films or violent video games, even though the science shows us that there has never been more gaming going on around the world, and yet we're not seeing that relationship or correlation with a surge of violence towards other people. But why do we do this? Because we're always looking for easy scapegoats. And when we fear, we tend to become a little bit more irrational. Parents and adults generally have always feared things that younger people are enticed by, that they don't understand, and is really not for them. Now, the Joker film is really an interesting case study because, again, it brings up some of these provocative and relevant topics, but it doesn't say anything. And some of that absence of saying something is also really difficult for people because they want resolution. They want a clear moral point of view. And with the absence of that, people assume that it's amoral, or they tend to, again, assume the worst about a film because it doesn't lay out explicitly that these things are bad, that this person is a bad person. Now, all of these biases, the illusory correlation, availability heuristic, the negativity bias, what they really do to us is that they really reduce our thinking to black and white, all or nothing thinking. And that, I believe, is at the heart of what's going on in our culture, and specifically about the uproar around Joker, is that we're not having nuanced conversations about these issues because the film is not having a nuanced conversation about these issues. And people find that problematic about the film, even though I would argue maybe it's really more of a mirror of what's happening in our culture rather than it's an indictment of the film itself. So all of these biases really, I think, is at the heart of our response and reaction to Joker. But tell me, what do you think? Do you believe that people are making much ado about nothing in terms of that cultural uproar? Or do you think I'm actually at fault here and that my own biases and blind spots warped my ability to read this film for what it is? Be sure to leave me your thoughts and comments about Joker and this episode of Psych Cinema. You're also welcome to leave a recommendation of any film or television show you'd like for me to tackle in a future episode. That's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I'm Jonathan Hetterly, and we'll see you at the movies.